This is All India Radio. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on India's long-term low-emission development strategy at Cop-27. The participants are Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of the Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India, and Sonu Sood, AIR correspondent.
At the UN Climate Change Conference COP26 in Glasgow, Prime Minister Narendra Modi committed to India's carbon reduction targets with a definitive timeline, a move which was lauded the world over. Now, at the ongoing COP27 in Egypt, Environment Minister Bhupinder Yadav launched India's long-term low-emission development strategy, LT-LEDS, becoming one of only 57 countries to do so. Ashish ji, how do you see this determined and proactive approach of India to fight climate change despite being a developing country? And what are the key highlights of India's long-term low-emission development strategy released yesterday?
I think it's indeed a great moment that a developing country like India has submitted its long-term emission development strategy. Before I start answering your question about the key highlights, I'd like to give you a little bit of a background and the Prashthbhumi, as they call it, of the low-emission development strategy. So if you look at the first sort of document which was released yesterday, there are four broad highlights which the government of India has talked about, which kind of articulate the need for the low-emission development strategy. The first one being that India has contributed very little to global warming. And this is, in fact, brought out by the best available science that from 1850 till 2019, India has contributed only, well, in fact, all of South Asia has contributed only 4% of global emissions. So India is a relatively small player as far as contribution to global warming. India, of course, is a developing country, so it still has significant energy needs for its development, and this is also very clearly articulated in this strategy. And India is committed to pursuing low-carbon strategies for development, and it's actively pursuing them. So in fact, the Prime Minister in the COP26 in Glasgow announced the Panchamrit, which was lauded world over, and India has expanded its renewable energy capacity dramatically over the last decade or so. And finally, so since climate is already happening and we've already seen the impacts in our own country, as well as in other parts of the world, India also needs to build climate resilience. So if you have these four sort of background elements, then as a result of that, India has articulated 7 broad areas of transition as a part of this low-emission development strategy. The first one is basically about low-carbon development of electricity. The second one is related to low-carbon transport system. The third one being sort of adaptation in urban design and, in fact, in urban areas because India is going to sort of rapidly urbanize. Then the fourth one is about the industrial sector, how to decouple the growth of the industrial sector from emissions. The fifth one is about carbon capture and storage, basically sucking out the carbon from the environment and then trying to utilize it for productive purposes. The sixth one is on enhancing forest and vegetation cover. And the final one is about the economic and financial aspects of low-carbon development. So it's a fairly comprehensive package, and I think we are on our way. We are on a good way.
So in this context, how do you see India's progress on renewable energy, greater use of nuclear energy, as also enhancing R&D into future technologies such as green hydrogen, fuel cells and biofuels?
So on renewables, especially solar and wind, I think India has had remarkable success. So in terms of installed capacity, we are fourth in the world. And of course, transition has been remarkable. Of course, now we are trying to sort of start thinking about how to make the solar panels and the windmills inside India. The National Hydrogen Mission, of course, was launched a couple of years ago. It aims to make India a hub for green hydrogen. And the strategy also talks about tripling nuclear power capacity by 2032. So we're really talking about a fairly diversified energy mix in the next few years. And of course, reliance on fossil fuels will be continuing for the next foreseeable future as well, because India needs to provide, well, energy security to its 1.4 billion people. But at the same time, the kind of costs which are incurred for the renewable energy transition, you need some kind of reliance on fossil fuels to stabilize the grid. And I think this is going to be the benchmark for big energy transition that we're talking about.
Talking of the cost element, what will be the cost element of India's transition to low-carbon development? And apart from mobilization of domestic finance, how much support, both in finance and technology, will be needed from international sources, from developed countries?
So this is where the strategy doesn't give you exact numbers in terms of the costing, but it gives you ballpark figures. So it cites a few studies, and the range is in tens of trillions of dollars. So it's not an insignificant amount, right? When you actually look at the commitment, the global commitment to a quantified goal for climate finance, it was $100 billion globally, right? So of course, the needs of a country like India would be way, way, way higher than what the quantified goal for all climate finance is concerned. But of course, that climate finance that we are talking about is supposed to be catalytic. It can actually leverage and mobilize many amounts, many multiples as compared to what is provided by developed countries. So coming back to the second part of your question about the amount of finance which is going to be made available, I think for a country like India, it's always going to be a minuscule proportion of its needs. The new quantified goal has to be negotiated. The developed countries have not been able to meet the goal of $100 billion yet. We need to agree on a much more ambitious goal going forward. But given the complexity of the global economy right now and the sort of crises that all the countries are facing, it's going to be a fraught battle. And I don't think the ambition of raising the quantified goal would be that easy. I think we'll really be having a challenge going forward.
So if we talk broadly and the current situation, what is the situation of climate finance from developed countries to developing countries for adaptation and loss and damage?
The loss and damage debate has been very contentious over the last 10, 12 years. So it's great that it's on the agenda. And of course, there has been lots of negotiation back and forth. And we'll see that during the course of this week in Sharm el-Sheikh, more intense negotiations would happen. But of course, the here and now, the climate is changing. Communities are suffering. Vulnerable communities are already suffering huge losses and damages. And some countries have come forward, right? So Denmark's made some commitment. Scotland's made some commitment. But these are token gestures. So these are in the range of $3 to $5 to $10 million. What we need is massive amounts of money to come to adaptation as well as loss and damage. So we have to wait till the negotiations come to an end during the course of this week. It's not going to be easy. I think we're already seeing a lot of resistance from developed countries. But I think one needs to find somehow a much more transformative way of thinking about negotiating as far as loss and damage is concerned. We have to take a much more humanitarian angle to this as well, because people all over the world will suffer. But some countries, because of the developmental deficits, will suffer a lot more.
When looking at top emitters, can you tell us about the rationale behind developing countries' demand that historical emissions also be taken into account and responsibility fixed in a fair and equitable manner?
If you look at the science behind climate change, it clearly says that what matters for the changing climate and greenhouse gas emission and global warming is the concentration of carbon dioxide equivalent in the environment and in the atmosphere. Now, that happens historically, right? So countries which have emitted more in the past should actually take a much more sort of larger burden of climate action. This is the rationale why developed countries which have grown on the basis of fossil fuels would need to contribute a lot more. And this is where the common but differentiated responsibility agenda and sort of the foundational principle of the UNFCCC is the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. There has been, of course, some dilution of that principle, but I think the differentiation amongst developed and developing countries remains. And that's why I think the developing countries are well nigh sort of in the right spot to argue that there has to be some historical responsibility. And therefore, if you have historical responsibility, then you should actually be financing the low-carbon transition in developing countries now as well. And this is the reason why we've seen a lot of these negotiations over the last few years talking about finance and access to technology.
Environment Minister Bhupender Yadav, representing India at Cop-27, pointed out that rich nations had not met their commitments for the 2020 deadline and called upon rich countries to intensify their carbon mitigation efforts and share their plans as to how they will reach net zero emissions, which he said developed countries should reach even before 2030. How do you see this leadership stand taken by India on behalf of developing countries?
The stand is mostly justified. The fact that developed countries should take a much stronger responsibility towards climate action as far as financing and access to technology is concerned. Now, reality of the global economy, I don't think it's going to be easy to start sort of the developed countries trying to take more responsibility before 2030. The push for collective action is important, but we need realistic timelines and realistic commitments. And for that, you will need to really negotiate. But I think it has to be also about how do we set up cooperative mechanisms so that we can globally achieve these targets.
What is the significance of global carbon budget? And how crucial is equitable and fair consumption of carbon budget by various countries? In this context, India's Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav has raised the issue of many developed countries turning back to increased fossil fuels consumption in recent times, which you also referred to just now. Can you tell us a little more about how this issue can be resolved?
The target of achieving 1.5 degrees or 2 degree warming to contain the global sort of warming to less than 2 degrees would imply that there is a carbon budget which is available for the entire, the global economy, the global society, the entire mankind. So that global budget needs to be appropriated and sort of allocated equitably in a just manner amongst developed and developing countries. The argument about what the minister said was that developed countries have actually exhausted or overdrawn their share of the global carbon budget, and they should leave adequate space for developing countries because they still need to develop to give a good quality of life to their own citizens. Now that's the concept and that's the struggle. That's basically the crux of the negotiations. Now, how do we allocate and allocate the carbon budget amongst developed and developing countries is where you need rules, you need some kind of an agreement. And of course, that agreement is not going to be reached in one COP after another COP. I think it's an evolutionary process and there is negotiation on commas and full stops. So I don't think we'll come to an agreement on what is the actual share of carbon for each of these countries. But I think the minister was well within his rights to actually articulate this position. And India will fight for the fair share of our carbon budget. And if we get it, it should ideally be allocated that space, or we should be allowed to grow by taking some part of the budget as part of our growing plan. And I think this is well justified as a negotiating tactic.
Ashishji, what do you feel energy efficiency and life, the lifestyle for environment, you feel these are important initiatives which need to be followed the world over?
Well, life is, of course, a global mission which the Prime Minister launched. And UN agencies, we are supporting very strongly, as UNDP, we are supporting very strongly the Lifestyle for Environment mission because data suggests that almost 1/4, anywhere between 1/3 to 2/3 of global emissions can actually be sort of influenced by individual choices on what we eat, how we dress, how we what kind of transportation choices we make, what kind of holidays we take. So I think these are all choices which influence our material and carbon footprint. And therefore, I think Lifestyles for Environment is a very strong message. And I think India has a very strong role as a global leader in bringing this message to the rest of the world. And this priority is also articulated very strongly in upcoming presidency of India for the G20. Energy efficiency is a no-brainer. The best energy saved is the one that you don't use. So if you can actually have energy efficient appliances which reduce the energy consumed per unit of use of those products, I think energy efficiency, and India has done brilliantly well with the Energy Star labeling initiated by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which still continues. And more appliances, I would say all appliances which use electricity should actually be brought under that ambit, especially appliances which use a lot of electricity like air conditioners and refrigerators and other kinds of equipment.
So the fight against climate change is a collective fight of the entire world, where every country, every citizen on the planet Earth has to do their bit on a war footing. And India's long-term low-emission development strategy is our country's firm commitment in that direction. Thank you so much, Ashishji, for joining us on All India Radio and throwing light on various aspects of this landmark initiative by India.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on India's long-term low-emission development strategy at Cop-27. The participants were Ashish Chaturvedi, Head of the Environment, Energy and Resilience at UNDP India, and Sonu Sood, AIR Correspondent. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of All India Radio. You can listen to it on our mobile app News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel News on AIR Official. You may email your opinion about this program at airnsdtalks@gmail.com.